Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stu Clark here. Today is the final video in the series on depth of field. And today we're going to look at how sensor size will affect the depth of field. In particular, we're going to be looking at it from a wildlife perspective. When you're talking about sensor size and wide angle lenses and kind of portraiture, there's a bunch of different factors that come in because they specifically make lenses for crop sensors. With the wildlife side of it, we're basically talking about with long lenses, 300 mil and up, they're almost always a full frame lens. Unless you're shooting in a micro four thirds format, everything is primarily made for a full frame sensor. In this one, we're going to be looking at it a bit more from the Nikon side of it, just I'm more familiar with the numbers there. And so we're talking about FX and DX. FX is the full frame and DX is a crop sensor with Nikon, which is a 1.5 crop. With wildlife, sensor size doesn't play as much as you may think when you're talking about depth of field. And we're going to kind of keep this fairly narrow to the depth of field aspect of sensor size. Down the road, I'll kind of dive into a more detailed view of how sensor size can impact from a noise level, from depth of field, obviously, and just some of the other factors that come into play when you're looking at sensor size. But we'll leave that for another day. Today, this is all about depth of field. So sensor size and depth of field, it's an interesting one because it only comes into play in certain situations. Only in certain situations you're really going to notice it. And so we're going to look at today, we're going to be looking at a blind or a setup situation where you've got feeders or something like that. You've got birds coming into a fixed position. We're going to be looking at proximity to the ground. How much, if you're looking at shorebirds or things like quail, ground birds, pheasants, grouse, that sort of thing, where you're dealing with birds low to the ground. We're looking at waterfowl. So that'll have a similar effect to birds on the ground, but we'll kind of look at that as well. We're looking at in-flight. Okay, so let's jump onto the computer and we'll go through a bunch of images that I've got where we can look at how the depth of field comes into play with the different sensors in different situations. And I think hopefully you get a lot out of this video and kind of I think there's a lot of misinformation when you're dealing with the sensor talk. I think some people, feel that full frame's the only way to go, or some people prefer DX because it offers you different benefits there. When you're dealing with depth of field, it's more nuanced than that. It's only certain situations where it really shows itself. And like I said, that's what we're going to go through and have a look at now. Okay, let's jump on the computer. Okay, so let's jump on Lightroom here, and we're going to go through some photos and basically show how sensor size will impact your image. And I think if you're new and you're trying to figure out which camera to buy, or trying to understand a lot of the talk online about how one sensor is better than the other for images, I think you'll get a lot out of this video and realize that a lot of it's hype. There's absolutely situations where a full frame sensor is phenomenal. The Z8's an amazing camera. I'd really struggle to go back to a crop camera at this point, but not for the reasons you might think. Okay, so first off, we're going to take a look at a full frame shot and a crop shot. So basically, one shot with the full frame camera, one is in the DX mode on the Z8, which is effectively shooting with a crop camera. So when you look at these two shots side by side, you're effectively looking at the same image. And for all intents and purposes, they are. Like I said, the Z8, the Z52, for example, are going to have the same pixel density. So pixel for pixel at 100%, they're the same. So that means that if you're standing at a certain position with a 500 mil lens, whether you're on a DX or an FX body, you're looking at the same pixels when you zoom into 100%. You're also going to end up with exactly the same depth of field. And this is where, like I said, this gets a lot more confusing when you get onto the wide angle side of things. Because when you get onto the wide angle side of things, what's happening is that you're dealing with a A lot of times the DX lenses will be a shallower depth of field. They'd be a 1.8 lens versus a 2.8 lens, for example. And there's other factors that come into play when you're looking at the wide angle side of it. But when you're dealing with the wildlife side of it, you're dealing with, those longer lenses. They're going to cover both FX and DX sensors. So once you get beyond 300 mil, there isn't really a DX. There's not a crop lens for long lenses, unless you're looking at the Micro Four Thirds, then that's looking for smaller sensors. But when you're dealing with crop sensors, there is no crop sensor long lens. That once you get to that longer lenses, they're going to cover both sensor size. So when you zoom out on these images, you'll notice that you're basically dealing with exactly the same depth of field. You're looking at, there's no difference here in how the depth of field is displayed between the two sensors. So these two shots are, this is a different perspective. So this is not, the one on the left is the DX, this is the crop, and this one is FX, this is full frame. Similar field of view. The difference being here though, I've moved forward another 10 feet for the FX sensor. So this image on the right is shot closer than the image on the left. And that is going to be the number one thing that comes out when you're talking about depth of field with crop sensors versus full frame sensors, is how close are you? And when it comes to a full frame sensor, because you've got more room around the edge of the sensor, you got more room to fill your subject, you can move closer for the same field of view, for the same view on your subject. And that's what's happening here. So this one is full frame and this is DX. So you'll notice here, there's subtle differences. It's not as dramatic as you might think in this situation where you've got quite a large bird. So I've still probably got 20 or 30 feet between me and the subject at this point. It's not like you're dealing with a shorebird when you're shooting at the minimum focus distance. And we'll look at those in a second here. But when you're dealing with a little bit longer distance, that blurred out background doesn't come into play quite so much. But you will notice there's definitely, it's smoother. If you look at the bokeh through here, comparatively, you can see how there's just more detail showing through. And it's funny, you don't often notice it on the zoomed in image, but you will notice it on the thumbnail when you're backed off a little bit. It's a funny thing with bokeh and that out of focus area. It actually shows a little bit more on a thumbnail than it does when you're zoomed in trying to figure out what's going on with the shot here. When you zoom out, you'll notice how, there's definitely, you can still see some of the trees in the background. There's still some detail, but overall there's more detail showing on the DX crop image. Both of them are totally acceptable. And like I say, for the difference of the cost of the camera, you can see that depth of field and getting that shallow depth of field when you're talking about wildlife, you won't see it in a lot of situations. And this is kind of a good example of, even by taking advantage of the extra distance and moving closer with the FX, you're still not really seeing a huge difference just because that 1.5 crop is not dramatic. You need to be, this shot here is probably 5 feet closer. And, it definitely, like I said, it blurs the background out a little bit. It takes some of that nervousness out of the background. But overall, very comparable images when you're just looking at depth of field. What does happen though, is that you'll notice that with the DX, because you're backed off of your subject, when you zoom into 100%, you'll actually end up getting more of the bird in focus because you're not kind of narrowing down that depth of field, but getting closer. So you don't have to stop it down as much. So with DX, you can shoot wide open a lot easier because you're backed off. You've got a greater depth of field. But with the FX, in order to get that, to get nice and close on them, you end up having to stop the lens down because you're kind of really narrowing that depth of field down by getting closer to your subject. And I think the one on the left is at f8 and the FX is at 7.1, so fairly close in aperture. I didn't have an exact example here. But you can still, even at 7.1, with the closer subject, I've still got amazing depth of field. You can see a great feather detail on this. And if you compare them at 100%, you will see how just how much closer the FX ends up being. You can see how it's a much closer image. It's going to be a lot more detail. And like I said, we'll cover that in a video down the road here for the FX excels. But in many situations, that 20 megapixel crop is more than enough. It's more than enough for social media. You can definitely print a poster 24 by 36 and make it look great with 20 megapixels. So for most use cases, the DX sensor is just fine. But like I said, the DFX does just give you some advantages. And again, we'll talk about that. So there's kind of a good example of how just you can see by moving closer with FX, because you've got more room around it, you can get closer to your subject with the same field of view on your subject, and it'll help to soften that background up a little bit more. Now let's take a look at a blind setup. So a blind setup's a good one because this is where you're going to be in a fixed position where you're in the blind, your subject is on a perch or whatever, however your setup is for being in a blind, or just a setup situation, whether on feeders or a water situation. And this is a good one where, again, if you're sitting side by side, one with FX, one with DX, both have 500mm lenses, but you're not getting beyond the crop. You can still fit your subject in on the DX sensor. There's no benefit almost at all to FX. But if you're able to get closer, that FX sensor will allow you to blur the background out a little bit better. And this is a great example of that. So if you look at these two shots here, you immediately see how the background blur on the bushes behind, how much smoother it is when you've zoomed in that extra distance with the FX compared to this is a shot at a DX distance, for example. So again, with DX, you will be further away to get the same field of view, which is going to make your depth of field larger. So if you're able to make up the distance, and this is the thing with FX, it's all about getting closer. And so if you're able to get closer to your subject, then you would be able to frame it with the DX. You're going to get a better background. And this is a great example that you can see how smooth the bushes are here, where they're much more in focus in this shot. And both of these are at 5.6, so the aperture's not coming into play in this shot at all. This is simply, like I said, bird is very, very similar field of view in the shot. They look very similar size. One's FX, one DX, and just because I've moved closer on the FX shot, it's dramatically smoothed out and blurred out the background, and it looks it's a much nicer, higher quality looking image in my opinion. Another comparison here, if you're looking at this Toei here, this is another good example. So this would be an FX shot, and with FX, because you've got that really nice shallow depth of field, you can see how the branches again blur out really quickly. Even though the background is right up against the perch he's on, it dramatically blurs out right away. And if you compare, so had I shot with a DX camera at this distance, you'd be looking at a much tighter crop. You're looking at just basically a portrait of the bird. So again, you zoom in, this is what the DX shot's going to look like compared to the FX. You're looking at the same pixels when you zoom into 100%. And that's something that you need to understand. But the depth of field will also be the same at the same distance. It's just that if you're trying to frame your bird nicely, that's where you can be closer with the FX sensor. And that's the big key here, is that if you want to frame the entire bird with DX, you've got to back up 10 feet. That's going to open up the depth of field quite a bit more just because you're further away from your subject. And that's the main difference between FX and DX when you're looking at the depth of field and how it relates to sensor size. Where this comes in, again, this little marsh wren here on the perch, if the background is further away, you wouldn't notice whether you're shooting on FX or DX. Because the background grasses come up, they're fairly close below the bird here. FX is really nice because I can be quite tight on the subject in a blind here, and then it gives a nice bokeh to the grasses coming up from below, and it does a really nice job there. This is a good example where this is basically this is kind of a DX crop, so this is cropped in. It's a little bit distance. I couldn't make up the distance on this subject. And this is one where I would have definitely benefited with this shot had I been able to get another 10 feet closer and take advantage of the FX sensor here. You can see how there's some busyness in the background, and just because I couldn't get closer, it's basically effectively a DX crop. You're going to see some nervousness, like I said, to the background. The flip side with this one, the background's much further. Because the background's further, whether I shoot comparatively FX to DX, there's no advantage. The background is far enough away that it's completely blurred out, whether or not I'm on a DX or FX crop. And even I'd move closer, there's no gain. There's not going to be any more background blur just because it was so far. It was actually across a valley in this point. So, it's 200, 300, 400 meters away at the minimum. So the background blur is not going to be affecting the depth of field, is not going to show whether you're shooting at FX or DX. You would see it on the bird a little bit more because this was shot at a DX distance. Like I said, this bird is nicely cropped with a DX. Had I moved closer with FX to get him in this full frame, I would have had to stop down in order to get the whole bird in focus, especially the tail. But in this situation, it just wasn't an option just because the bird wouldn't let me get any closer. One of the biggest things when you're looking at FX for the DX, and where you're going to really see the benefit of the larger sensor, obviously once you get close, is when you've got a foreground in the image. And so basically what happens is when you're looking at an FX shot, even if you could crop in more, even if you could shoot it at DX level, what you notice is you get the foreground, you've got more of it showing because you've got the bigger sensor. So even if you're shot from what would be a DX distance, you've got more foreground showing is out of focus and more background showing is out of focus because your subject's in the smaller in the frame. And that will give you that kind of a bit of a bokeh look and a bokeh effect compared to when you just look at the crop. So this is basically a DX crop of that image. And you notice how it's the same shallow depth of field in the two images. It's the same shallow depth of field, but with the crop, you've eliminated all of this foreground bokeh, and you've also eliminated some of the background bokeh. So it gives you a tighter crop on the bird. It looks great. Both of them look great, but that's when a lot of what you're seeing when people say that, oh, you've got a lot better bokeh on an FX lens. It's just that you've got more of it showing in a lot of situations. You can see it's just very, very shallow depth of field in both of these, and it's just the perception of what you see in the image. So where FX is really nice, you can see there's gulls in the background here. Because this has got, I'm taking full advantage of the FX sensor in this shot, and what it allows me to do by being super low to the ground, you can see it's got a razor thin depth of field because I'm really close. This Dunlin is almost filling the frame. So there's no cropping needed on the shot. I've gotten as close as they need to be. And you can see how shallow the depth of field is. But most importantly, even at 6.3, where I've got a little bit extra depth of field to get most of the bird in focus, he's on the same plane as my sensor by being parallel to me. And so I'm going to be nice, and you can see there's a little bit of out of focus on the feathers at the tail there, but most of the body and head is nicely in focus. And you can see how at 6.3, probably could have gone down to f8 to get a bit more of the legs in focus. The problem is when you go down to f8, you're going to start to see some of those birds in the background start to come out a little bit more as well. So this is a great example where that FX versus DX. If I was shooting in DX, you would have seen a lot more detail of those gulls in the background. Even though I'm low to the ground, even though I'm really close, I would have had to been backed up 3 or 4 feet on this shot, and you'll definitely get more of that background starting to come into focus. So waterfowl is definitely one area where a full frame sensor really excels because it does an amazing job of giving that really nice blurred foreground and background. So this pintail shot's a great one too when you're looking at FX here. So with FX, you can just see how the background just immediately goes to a beautiful blur. Same with the foreground. Again, this is shot right at water level, so really taking advantage. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, we're talking about the angles and getting low to your subject. You can see this one's kind of taking all those factors into effect here, where I've gotten super low to the subject, full frame. So I've got both birds nicely framed in the shot. So you got awesome background blur, awesome foreground blur. What's interesting here is that there's a bunch of gulls showing in the background here. And had this been shot at DX, in order to get both birds in focus, I would have had to been either zoomed out or stepped back. Because of that, you end up with in order to get further back, you need a larger depth of field, and you're definitely going to start seeing a lot more of the subjects in the background start to come into focus, and you'll really lose a lot of that dreamy bokeh effect. However, if you compare it to just a crop of those two shots, where this is the DX crop on the left here versus on the right, and this is where with DX it allows you to get closer. It doesn't allow you to get closer. It frames it differently based on the sensor. You're looking at the same shot. Like I said, you zoom into 100%, you're looking at exactly the same shot. It's just one's going to frame it differently in camera for you. You're not going to be able to get both birds in focus, but you're going to get that similar. Again, you can see how the reflection is mostly in focus in the shot, and then it's beyond the reflection here is where that bokeh starts to come in. Like I say, that larger sensor gives you more bokeh by being more out of focus in the foreground. Another shot here is a great example of just how dreamy the FX look can be. But you can just see how amazing, especially when you're dealing with fall colors, any sort of reflections like that. You can just see all the colors beautiful right into the foreground here in that bokeh. It's all nicely out of focus. And then again, shot at 5.6. And you just gives it a really just overall really nice image. And that's one of the real beautiful thing shooting with FX. It just really kind of makes it, it just gives you that nice bokeh effect throughout the image. That it's very difficult to get this with a DX unless you're shooting with either f4 or 2.8, because you're going to be shooting at a longer distance. You need that extra stop on the lens in order to give you that blurred out background and foreground. And finally, let's take a look at in-flight. And so with in-flights, generally with in-flight, it's not going to have a lot of impact, because a lot of times you're in-flight, you're going to be shooting against the sky or against a very distant background. And there's going to be certain situations. So if you look at, here's a good example of how you can see this is shot at FX, and you can just see how the image is definitely blurred out quite nicely. It's definitely rendered the background quite out of focus. It'd be very tight for a DX crop in order to actually follow the bird effectively. When you look at this one, you can still, there is some, you'll see the trees, there is some nervousness. This background is, it's probably half a kilometer away, if not a little, maybe 800 meters. It's a long way away across the lake in this shot. And so it's a long way away, and you can still see some of the detail in it, even though the bird's fairly close to the camera in this shot. This one here, as the duck has gotten that, it's another 15 feet closer to me at this point. It's almost filling the FX. You can see now how much better the background blur has gotten. It has come a little bit further around, so the background is a little bit further on this shot, but you can still see how smooth the background bokeh is, because you basically filled the frame in FX and you basically almost completely blurred out the background. You can still see some color to it, so you know it's not just shot against the blue sky, which is really nice. But that's something that's one of those things where in DX, so you've got to be framing this shot quite a bit further out, and you're definitely going to get a lot more of that background showing in focus in the same sort of shot. But having a bit of a foreground for your in-flights is where FX is beautiful, because you've got the larger sensor. It allows to have some of the grasses show of the bottom of the image. This gives that really kind of that, it's the ideal sort of image that you're going for, where you've got the grasses showing with a completely out of focus blurred background behind your subject. And this is kind of that, when you're out there looking for in-flight shots, this is kind of that perfect sort of shot. If I'd shot this in DX, for example, if you crop this to a DX size, you lose almost all of the grasses in the foreground, and it loses a lot of its appeal, I would say. This is a shot that I kind of went for more of a longer crop. So this one I ended up doing 2x1 crop on it. So I get a nice crop of the subject. This is obviously a grassland habitat that this swallow's hunting in, and it really kind of puts it into place for the viewer. And this one, again, FX is good. It's not perfect. This is a good example where even, this widgeon as it's taking off, full frame, really close, and you're still going to see some detail in the background. It's not perfect. I need to get a little bit lower. With this shot, I was shooting down. So as the bird took off, I'm still kind of shooting fairly tight to the water in the foreground. Had I been sitting a little bit lower as that bird flew off, it would have been against the forest background. That's another, at the upper edge up here. So it would have given a lot more blur to the entire image, and the bird would have really stood out against the blurred background. Even with that FX sensor, you're getting really close. Your angles will still come into play on how you're positioned against your subject and trying to get the background as far as possible from your subject as you can. In this shot, this was kind of a really cool shot. This one, this would have been all completely impossible with DX because it was so close. This mallard came just right past me. And this one's pretty neat because you can see how this post is not very far behind the mallard in this shot. And you can see how it's still really nicely out of focus. It's pretty amazing how nice it is. And just a really shallow depth of field on the mallard's head is pretty amazing. And this was shot at 10,000 ISO, so kind of a real low light shot, a real grab shot as the bird came flying past me. And you just wouldn't have had a chance with DX. I would have completely missed the wingtips and everything else. But this one again, this is a neat shot, framed at 2x1. It just makes for a really cool effect where you're getting that background out of focus and looks great. So that's kind of sensor size in a nutshell for how it affects depth of field. Well, I hope you got some good information out of that video today. Like I said, it's a bit of a difficult one sometimes to grasp, and I hope kind of by looking at these samples, it gives you an idea of where you're going to see the difference between FX and DX. And, you can kind of, it'll help you, hopefully help you improve your photography a little bit in those situations. So thank you for joining me today. Until next time, we'll see you out there. Take care.